From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Spring is approaching, and the garden beckons, which means it's not too early to start making gardening and landscaping plans for the year. And if you're like a lot of homeowners in Colorado, you might be thinking about adding some native plants. Experts say it's a great way to save water. Native plants also support bees, birds, and other pollinators. And native vegetation can require less pruning than more traditional plantings. Our guest today is Tommy Roth. He's one of the horticulture experts at the Colorado State University Extension who help the public with questions about their yard and landscaping. And he's especially passionate about landscaping with native plants.
There are so many benefits of natives, and there's so many reasons to consider switching over to natives. A lot of our native pollinator species, our bees and our wasps and our flies and all of our native caterpillars that make these beautiful butterflies and moths, they actually rely on native plants for all of their food. And it's a lot more difficult for them to eat non-native plants.
Huh. I had no idea that was the case. That's so interesting. Tommy, are you getting more calls lately about switching over to native plants?
We definitely are. So as this trend continues to increase and people start to learn about these things, more research is coming out as well over the last 10 years that has really pointed us in the direction of natives for gardening. They also have a lot of benefits for water savings. In Colorado, we're running out of water. More and more people are moving to our state. So it's really going to be important in the future. If we want to sustain large-scale human life here, we're going to need to be conserving water. Natives evolved in our ecosystem. So they evolved to these very dry, drought-prone conditions that
Sure.
I'm sure all the listeners are used to. So it can really be a great option. People can save tons of water when compared with a Kentucky bluegrass lawn if they were to replace it with native wildflowers.
I like the sound of that. Okay, so my yard is small. It's a Kentucky bluegrass lawn that has some river rock around the edges and the tiny oak tree that maybe, hopefully, will give some shade one day.
Mm-hmm.
What should be the first changes I would think about if I'm planning to go with more native species this year?
So I think the first thing to understand is that it's not an all or nothing thing. So if you're a homeowner and you don't want to get rid of all your lawn, that's perfectly understandable. If you have dogs, if you have kids that you want to run around with, totally understandable. So I think a good place to start would be the edges of the lawn. Maybe try reducing some of those corner areas near fences or areas near your house. In a lot of cases, those can be replaced with natives without actually compromising the usefulness of the turf.
And if I'm putting in native vegetation, replacing the grass seems like it would be the biggest part of the job. For those who want to do that, what native grasses do you recommend to homeowners?
We have a few native grasses, though. People may have realized we are in a grassland ecosystem here. When you drive around on the Front Range,
Sure.
there's grasses everywhere. And fortunately, you can plant those as turf. So two of our really common native turf grass species, I would say, are buffalo grass, which is a little bit more of a traditional turf grass look. It
Okay.
might look a little bit more similar to Kentucky bluegrass. And then another option would be blue grama. And blue grama is not a traditional turf grass. It's going to be a little bit taller. You want to keep it taller, but it's a very beautiful grass. It has a lot of ornamental value.
Do homeowners need to do any kind of soil treatment for these native plants, or are the existing soils good enough?
That's a great question. So a lot of people think the soil here, this is what the plants evolved for. We can just put them right into the soil. Sometimes that's not the case.
Right.
So in a lot of cases, I would recommend that homeowners would add compost to their soil and then to fertilize with a fertilizer that contains nitrogen prior to planting any natives, just to ensure that those natives are going to have a great start to their life and have the nutrients they need to take hold in an area.
Tommy, I really like the idea about starting with the edges of the yard or the corners. What sort of ornamental native plants do you recommend here?
Oh, there's so many options. Some of my favorites, I would say number one favorite would be milkweed. The reason I love this plant is because it attracts monarch butterflies. And seeing monarchs in the late summer is one of the really special things about living in Colorado.
Yes.
I highly recommend planting a native milkweed species. We also have things that are already commonly planted that are native, like yarrow. Yarrow is common in even non-native landscapes because it's very showy. It'll stay during the winter too. But there's so many different options, hundreds and hundreds of different types of wildflowers that people can consider.
How should I think about spacing when I put in different plants? Are there some that do better right next to each other or some that prefer to be away from other plants?
Definitely. Some of our native plants, they get really excited when you plant them and they like to spread. A really common example of this is a plant called rabbit brush. It's extremely common in our area, has beautiful yellow flowers in the late summer, but it also really likes to grow and it likes to spread. So if you're considering planting something like a rabbit brush, you're going to want to make sure you don't plant that right next to a plant like a columbine that likes to go really slowly and likes to take its time. But in the other case, some plants actually need to be close together. One of the most charismatic plants of the West is called an Indian paintbrush. This is something I can guarantee that everyone has seen. It's got a flower that comes up, and it looks just like a red paintbrush. It's a beautiful plant. And this plant is actually semi-parasitic. It can't actually live healthily on its own. It's going to need to be planted next to a blue grama grass. And it's actually going to feed off of that blue grama. I see people all the time wanting to plant an Indian paintbrush, and it's not going to do well unless you plant it next to a blue grama.
Well, Tommy, native plants use less water than traditional landscaping, as you mentioned. What kinds of water savings do people often see after they overhaul their yard?
Yeah, people could see a water use reduction of 2 to 3 times compared to a Kentucky bluegrass lawn. Now, people are still going to need to water because sometimes we have extended periods of drought that can lead to lots of plant death, even in nature. This is a natural thing that happens. But people could see drastic reductions in the amount of water that they're using in their yard.
And let's say I am putting in some plants and I'm planting sparsely, making sure I give enough room for the plants that like to grow. How long will it take before I can expect to see my garden looking full?
Normally, it's going to take about a year for everything to kind of grow in, find its place. But if you were to plant things that were, a little bit older, a little bit larger, you could be filled in by the end of the season. A lot of our wildflowers, they're annuals, which means that they grow from seed every year. So if you planted a field full of wildflowers, you would see that filled in. If you planted it in May, you would see that filled in by the end of the growing season.
Good to know. Well, and I don't have a lot of patience, so I'm thinking about that rabbit brush thing.
Oh, yeah. So that'll take over now.
That's what I need. Tommy Roth is with Colorado State University Extension. We'll include a link to their website where you can find whole catalogs of recommended native plants in our show notes and at kunc.org. We also want to hear your gardening questions. Is there something you've been wanting to do that you'd like additional advice on? Send us an email at noco@kunc.org, and we'll get answers from our friends at the CSU Extension. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.